Hello and welcome again to my channel. When it comes to the film business, movies often tend to get, well, cancelled. Disney, being of course such a major player in the film business, has a rich history of this. And a lot of those projects that got cancelled happen to be sequels or prequels to already existing Disney properties. So today that's what I am doing. I am counting down a list of the top 10 Disney sequels or prequels that were cancelled. The order that I try to put this list in is kind of like from what I found least interesting to most interesting. It's very opinion based, but yeah. Here we go. Number 10, Bambis Children. Now, a lot of you may not be aware of this, but Bambi was actually originally based on a book, and that book had a sequel of that name. It was about Bambi and Feline's twin children, Gino and Guri. I don't know how to say those names. But much like the first film with Bambi, this one would feature the twins as they grew into adulthood. It was considered in 1944 and would have been a theatrical release. But eventually the idea was scrapped, and that's more because it was more of an idea thrown around than anything else. However, there was a release of the book Bambis Children that featured illustrations from Walt Disney Productions, so that's as close as we're gonna get to that movie. Now, I've never been a huge fan of Bambi. I think it's more cutesy than anything else, which is fine for what it is. But I would be all for a sequel to Bambi if it was a theatrical release. Instead, we ended up with Bambi 2 in 2006. Now, as a lot of you probably are aware of, there was this era where Disney was just releasing like a ton of straight-to-video sequels, and that went from like the mid-90s to mid-2000s-ish. But luckily that faded out of existence, so we probably have a bit more time before Disney has another stupid idea. Number 9, The Nightmare Before Christmas 2. In 2001, Disney considered making a sequel to this beloved classic, but their idea was to ditch the stop motion and use computer animation. And if you ask pretty much anyone who likes Nightmare Before Christmas, that is a terrible idea. Tim Burton was able to convince them not to do that as he wanted to keep the purity of the original alive. It's another example of a Disney project that was definitely being considered, but it didn't get very far into production at all. Since then, director Henry Selick has actually expressed interest in doing a sequel, though he said Tim Burton would have to be involved somehow for him to do it. So the chances of that ever happening are very slim. It's probably more likely we get a live action one, which I pray to God that doesn't happen. However, there was a video game sequel made in 2004 simply titled Nightmare Before Christmas: Oogie's Revenge, and Tim Burton was actually involved in that. I never played it, but it's certainly something that piques my interest. Number 8, Chicken Little 2, The Ugly Duckling Story. Now this is one that was likely going to be direct to DVD, which is really strange actually, considering that if you think Disney had a lot of faith in their movie, they would have put money towards a theatrical released sequel. And it was canceled for the exact reason you think it'd be. It was canceled because of the first film's backlash. It was going to feature like a love triangle between Chicken Little, Abby the Ugly Duckling, and this new character who was a French sheep. And of course, I think it would mostly feature Abby the Ugly Duckling as the main character, as she has to compete with her. Are we just going to ignore that Chicken Little's mom is dead? There were some animatics that I found on Vimeo that seemed pretty legit. It just kind of shows off a little bit about like what the movie could have been. I do not share the same hate that I think most people do for Chicken Little. I mean, I remember liking it as a kid, but I still believe it's probably for the best that this sequel never happened. Number 7, Tron III.
Well, it wasn't a bad life. If only I could get back that time I spent watching Tron Legacy.
Leela, I've made up my mind. Before we die, I'm gonna find and destroy every remaining copy of Tron Legacy. It may take a couple of hours.
This is a much more recent one that many of us are aware of. Tron 3 was originally planned for a 2018 release, which is this year. But if you know anything about Disney, then you know that they have a very busy slate, and that's what led to cancellation. I mean, just look at like Disney's schedule. They've got movies planned for the next 5 years, and I don't doubt that many of those are going to get canceled as well. It was never officially greenlit. Tron 3 was just being developed at the time. What we do know is that it's very likely it would have starred Jared Leto. However, I think the biggest problem with the Tron 3 is that now that Disney owns Star Wars, they don't really need Tron. I mean, the only reason that Tron and a bunch of other sci-fi Disney movies of the 80s were made is to compete with Star Wars. Could this movie still happen? Yes, but probably not for a long time. And I think this is a project that it's probably best they take some time on. I mean, I was not a Tron Legacy fan at all, and at this point I think a reboot might be the best plan of action. Number 6, The Seven Dwarfs. The Seven Dwarfs was planned to be a direct-to-video prequel to Snow White. It was going to be a CG project by Disney Toon Studios, and it was to be directed by Mike Dice, who's also known for directing Hoodwinked 2. Wow. Management actually changed around the idea, and they wanted to focus the movie more on Dopey, which sounds like a terrible idea at first until you hear what the plot was going to be. The movie was going to explain how Dopey lost his voice while witnessing the death of his mother. And it was canceled by John Lasseter in 2006, just like that. I didn't want to have to mention John Lasseter in any way, but he actually has a lot to do with these sequels getting canceled. There's also another proposed sequel to Snow White, and that was Snow White Returns. This wouldn't be a full-length movie, it would just be a short film. It would just tell a story using some of the deleted scenes they had lying around from the first film, such as the soup eating scene with the song, or a scene where the dwarves build a bed for Snow White.
We do know that following the amazing success of Snow White, that there was a great demand from the viewing public for more cartoons with the dwarves. But we also know that 2 major sequences that were developed for Snow White were deleted from the final film. These 2 sequences happen to figure really prominently in the story outlined by these newly discovered images.
But I'm alright with this never being finished, as it doesn't really add anything meaningful to Snow White. It's just kind of a way to use up extra animation.
A crown with precious jewels.
Yeah.
A golden harp with angels on it.
A royal coach with 6 white horses.
Yeah.
I do, however, want to see that Dopey movie. Number 5, Fantasia 2006. Development for Fantasia 2006 began way back in 2002. It was being developed after Fantasia 2000 was fairly successful. There were actually 4 animated shorts that were produced and finished for this movie. There was One by One, a short film about kids in Africa building and flying kites, which was supposedly put in as a special feature in the DVD release of Lion King 2. There's Lorenzo, the story of a mean cat whose tale comes to life, and that won an Annie Award. There's A Little Match Girl, which is a really sad story about a little girl trying to sell matchsticks as she slowly freezes to death and imagines being in a warm house with her grandmother. I watched all those in preparation for this video, and that one made me thoroughly depressed. And Destino, which may be the most interesting one. It started as a collab between Walt Disney and Salvador Dali. It was actually canceled around the time of World War II and was brought back into production in 1999 by Walt Disney's nephew. And it had an eventual release in 2003. All of these clips together, though, only add up to a little over 20 minutes. There were a few more ideas thrown around. There was the idea of one that'd be set in Australia, and a rumor about a British sequence that'd be set to a Beatles song. This movie was scrapped for unknown reasons, which is pretty sad because I think this is a movie I'd be really interested in. I love Fantasia, and I would love to see Disney bring another Fantasia project to life someday. Number 4, Aristocats 2. Aristocats is a fairly simple Disney movie. There's not really a lot to it, but I think that's why I like it. There was a sequel being planned to this in 2008, which is fairly strange considering that the straight-to-DVD Disney sequels were kind of on their way out around that time. It was originally going to be 2D animation, but eventually changed into CGI. There's a small chance that this would have had a theatrical release, but it's much more likely that this was straight-to-video. The sequel was going to take place on a cruise ship and involve a jewel thief. Todd Carter, who was a storyboard artist on this movie, said that it would be like Murder on the Orient Express without the murder. Some concept art was made for this, and to be honest, it doesn't look bad at all. Executives did not know if an Aristocats sequel would do well, so they canceled it. I can't see a movie like Aristocats 2 as being a masterpiece, but I wouldn't have minded it. Number 3, Dumbo 2. Dumbo is a Disney movie I don't really care too much for. By no means is it a bad movie, but I think the only part that really sticks with me is the part towards the end when he flies. Also the train song, it's a very catchy song.
Casey Jr.'s coming down the track with a smoky stack. Hear him puffin' coming round the hill. Casey's here to thrill every Jack and Jill.
This is one of those rare canceled sequels that actually has a lot known about it. It's going to be directed by Robert C. Ramirez, who is known for directing the animated film Joseph, King of Dreams. I never saw that movie though, so I don't know too much about it. It was originally planned to be released in 2001, but was delayed. But what's really interesting about this movie to me is that on the Dumbo 60th anniversary VHS and DVD, they actually have a behind the scenes trailer for Dumbo 2.
A lot of people said, oh, it always makes me cry. I mean, it was quite believable.
The challenge will be in making a sequel that does the same.
A lot of detailed concept art can be found for this movie. It was going to be set a day after the first movie. It would be about all the baby circus animals getting lost in New York.
The kids accidentally get themselves disconnected from the rest of the circus, and they end up in the big city.
They want to have this freedom, but they also have to try to figure out how they're going to get back home.
And there was this interesting idea where each baby animal represented a different stage of childhood, and they would each have to solve their problems to find their way home. Multiple characters, all with distinct personalities, were created for this. And it was also canceled by John Lasseter after he became CEO of Disney in 2006. Number 2, Roger Rabbit 2, The Toon Platoon.
I just flew in, and boy, am I on fire! My name's Roger, but you can call me Roger.
I think one of my favorite things that Disney has ever done is Who Framed Roger Rabbit. This was actually planned to be a prequel, and the first draft for it was written in 1989. It took place in 1941 to 1943 during World War II. Roger Rabbit discovers that he's adopted and goes out on a search for his mother. You can actually find out a lot of plot and character details about this movie on the Disney Wiki. Like they were going to have a character by the name of Richard Davenport, who was pretty much a replacement for Eddie. And then some other characters would be Otto Green, Wendy Rowan. Of course, you have the return of Roger Rabbit and Jessica, and then you have a few new tunes. But Steven Spielberg refused to sign on to this movie due to its extremely cartoonish depiction of Nazis. Considering that Steven Spielberg did grow up in a Jewish family and he has done a lot of World War II movies, then his reasoning makes complete sense. I also think the World War II setting is just, well, odd. I mean, would it be including racist caricatures? Because I hope not. The movie did go through a lot of different rewrites in the 90s, but ended up being overall too expensive. There was some test footage made of it though that combined 2D animation with CGI, and it actually looks pretty good.
So what do you think, big fella?
However, with a sequel or prequel or whatever to Roger Rabbit, I do not know how they would kind of get around that whole controversy of who owns the rights to it. This was a project that's definitely been shelved, but it could still happen, and if it did, I wouldn't have any problem with it. Number 1, Treasure Planet 2. Treasure Planet 2 was a movie that was actively being developed. Director June Falkenstein, who did the Tigger movie, was set to direct. This was a movie that was in development for more than 8 months. But of course, with the first movie ending up being a box office failure, everything changed. The first screenplay they wrote was actually finished, and you can find a deep synopsis of it online. It would be about Jim Hawkins and his new love interest, Kate, as they attended the Royal Interstellar Academy. They would have to team up with Long John Silver in order to stop the villain Ironbeard from freeing inmates of the Botany Bay prison asteroid. Willem Dafoe was even signed on to play the villain Ironbeard, which was a big deal considering that Spider-Man came out just a few years before that. There was a plan not only to expand this to sequels, but to a TV series as well. What could have happened with Treasure Planet is very similar to what happened with Lilo and Stitch. I'm not quite sure if this would have been a theatrical release or straight to video, but I think there's a pretty big chance that it would have been theatrical. Now, there are people like me who actually do really like Treasure Planet, and we would love to see a sequel like this get made, but I don't think Treasure Planet has enough of a following to warrant that. We can only imagine what could have been. So that about sums it up. I know there are a few canceled Disney sequels that I missed, like Hercules 2 or Pinocchio 2. If you'd like to in the comments, tell me which sequel, prequel, or whatever you would have liked to see the most. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.